Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at onpurposely.com.
It's a special edition of the All Mom Does podcast today, and I can't wait to jump in. Today is part one of taking your questions and talking through some ideas and some answers. I'm Julie Lyles Carr. Thanks so much for joining me today. We put out the call to you for your listener questions, and you might just hear what you've asked on the podcast today. This will be a two-part episode, so be sure and tune in next time as well to see if maybe your question is going to be featured. I have to admit, I love doing Q&As on all kinds of things. I do quite a bit of speaking across the country at events and conferences, and some of my favorite times are when we do like a question and answer panel, and we take those questions and we get to talk about it with those people in the audience. And this is why. There's what I think you're thinking about, and sometimes I get it right. But there is also what you are really thinking about and wondering about. And sometimes I've got a pretty good bead on what moms, wives, friends are wondering about today. And sometimes I really get surprised. So if you've submitted a question, thank you so much. It really is helpful to know what you need as a listener, what the things are that you're facing, where you're looking for ideas and information. It's really so great. So thank you so much. So our first question for this episode comes from Brooke. She writes, "How can I be a good mom with high functioning anxiety? I have been told not to worry so much, to let go and let God, basically. But even though I'm a believer and my faith is very strong, I still find myself struggling with a ton of anxiety." Now, I want to give one of those little disclaimers like you hear like at the end of a car commercial. So I'm not promising that this is going to line up with everything that any professional might tell you. I'm just talking about my life and my challenges with anxiety, what I have observed in helping people through the years when I was in a pastoral position, those kinds of things. So that's my little disclaimer. But I do have some thoughts for you, Brooke. And for those of you listening who identify with her question and you're like, oh yeah, that's me. I feel like I'm just grappling with anxiety all the time. I have some thoughts for you. So I have to give you a little bit of a backstory. I have members in my external family, people I was raised around, who were, their challenges with anxiety were really significant. And I will say this was in an era for them where it wasn't like they'd had their medical doctor or their therapist say to them, "Oh, you're dealing with anxiety." I mean, let's all just take a moment to be thankful for the fact that this cluster of feelings that we can experience, we have language for now where we can say, wow, I'm really dealing with some high levels of anxiety. That verbiage really hasn't been around for a long time. So think of that as, hey, blessing number one, that we can even just identify what these varieties of symptoms and thought processes are, and that we can put them in this bucket and go, oh, I'm experiencing anxiety. So let's start there, that this was not vernacular verbiage that these extended family members were equipped with because of the times in which they were living and came into adulthood. But I can look back and go, oh, wow, there was some varsity level anxiety going on. And the way that it would often end up expressing itself, because again, we're talking about family members who didn't have language, didn't have tools for dealing with this, was a high level of what I would call nervousness. It often expressed itself in getting really, really snippy, very upset, a lot of deep concern over details for, say, a family holiday meal, or a lot of feeling a little bit, resentful because the anxiety feelings were driving some of these family members to take on more and more and more to try to make sure everything was covered. Sometimes it looked kind of controlling. And so when other people didn't meet whatever those expectations were, it was, well, then I'm the person who has to do it because nobody can do it like I can do it. And yet going into that place where you're taking on more can really get your nervous system all cranked up, and it can be more anxiety in all of its varieties and flavors. And so because I had grown up observing this, you know how sometimes when you grow up with something, you either find yourself emulating it in the same way because that's what you grew up knowing, or in my case, I looked at it, maybe this will sound a little judgy. I'm expecting you to give me some grace here. And I thought, well, I am never going to be like that. Like, I am not going to be in tears at all the family holiday meals. I'm not going to freak out over different things. I am not going to be that. And so I would have told you for a very long time that I did not deal with anxiety. I just really didn't think I did. I didn't act like some of the modeling that I had seen as a kid and in my early adulthood. So therefore, right, that was my science. I don't have anxiety. And yet the more acquainted I became with the contours of anxiety, with the way that it shows up, with the way that it leaks out, if you will, I began to realize over the last few years, oh, I also seem to have a lot of anxiety. I just handle it and express it and deal with it in some different ways than what I grew up in, but I'm definitely still within the camp. So when we talk about anxiety, let's first of all identify some of the things that you might feel, you might experience if you are grappling with anxiety. So for example, you might feel like, okay, I've got this upcoming project that I feel nervous about, but you also find that it's making you more irritable, or you're sweaty or fidgety, or you're afraid to even jump into this project. Sometimes it means that you just have no focus. You know you need to get something done, but it just feels impossible to get that project across the finish line. That can actually be a symptom, a sign of anxiety. Sometimes it means you have no energy, because your system has gone into such overwhelm with your anxious thoughts that you find that it's really difficult to get it done at all. There's some interesting conversation right now. You know how we've been saying that a lot of procrastination has to do with perfectionism, and that can be true. If you want to do something, but you're afraid you can't do it perfectly, it may cause you to put it off and put it off. However, there is also some growing conversation that sometimes procrastination has to do with anxiety, that you're so freaked out about what you need to get done that your energy just gets depleted and you don't find that you have the reserves you need to get something across the line. Sometimes anxiety can look like restlessness. Sometimes it can be things like a lack of appetite, or your stomach's upset, or your heart's racing, or you have a headache, or you find that your sexual desire has dropped. But it can also be things like overeating, things like insomnia. Okay, that was a big clue for me, because I would have never told you that some of my eating habits had to do with anxiety. I didn't necessarily connect that some of the overeating when I had a big project deadline or something like that had anything to do with anxiety. But it is connected. My insomnia that I experience off and on and have for years and years and years, that can be a sign of anxiety. And so what it can lead to at times is everything from depression, feeling really low, forgetfulness, confusion, or feeling like you're out of balance emotionally. But it can also be things like erratic decisions and anger and panic attacks. All of those things can be indicators that we may be dealing with anxiety. And again, for me, when I look at this list, most of this list I don't really seem to experience, but the fidgetiness, the restlessness, the insomnia, the overeating, oh yeah, that's got my name all over it. Even though I don't tend to have the same kind of outbursts or the same emotional, like maybe teary or that kind of thing, I don't usually do that, but these other things are absolutely me. And it was important for me to understand that that grouping of feelings and effects were also still a really strong indicator of anxiety in my own life. But I think there's something interesting in Brooke's question that I do want to point out too, because this is another place that I wrestled with understanding what I was dealing with. You know, sometimes what we do when we're feeling anxious and we don't understand to identify it as such is we can call it high performance. I know. I'm not coming for you. I'm just saying that's what it's been in my case, where you just keep going and going and going and going. You get all the things done. You're the person everybody can count on. You make sure all of the bases are covered. You do all of it, all of it, all of it. And in my case, because I was so determined to not come across as irritable and emotionally fragile as some of the modeling I'd seen in my family of origin and in my extended family, I was determined to always do it with a smile and with the biggest sense of humor that I could possibly conjure. And what's interesting about that is when we talk about high functioning anxiety, that's a differentiator that's really important. Anxiety sometimes can just stop us in our tracks. We can't go, we can't do it, we're afraid, we're terrified. And a couple of my kids have dealt with anxiety on that level. They have social anxiety. They don't want to have to go do the thing. They are nervous to order at the drive-through. They don't want to actually have to walk into the bank to deposit a check. That seems really overwhelming. That's what I always thought about as anxiety, things that were holding you back. But as it turns out, my understanding of that was a little bit limited. To really be grappling with anxiety also means that you can be a high performer and your nervous system can still be in full warning the whole time, just like it would be for somebody who is grappling with feeling like they can't get stuff done because they are dealing with feelings of anxiety. So I think it's important, and I love that Brooke brought this up, this sense of high functioning anxiety, because you may not look that anxious to other people because you're still so capable. You're still getting stuff done. And so it takes a really profound level of self-awareness to back up and realize, oh man, even though I am still getting all this stuff done, I'm doing it from a place of fear. I'm doing it from a place of feeling overwhelmed. I'm doing it from a place where my cortisol levels, which is your stress hormone levels, are through the roof and I'm still going, even though my body is sending me all these signals that I should take my foot off the gas. So what is it for you? Are you dealing at times where you feel like you just can't do stuff because you're so scared, you're so anxious? Or are you finding that you're doing all the things and part of that is an attempt to try to quell feelings of anxiety, but really what's going on is you are increasing more and more over time in your body, in your feelings, in your hormone levels, more and more nervous juice, if you will. That place where you just keep going and you just keep pouring on the cortisol to keep going. So think about what you're dealing with when it comes to the symptoms and the signs, the effects, and what kind of anxiety that you're dealing with. I think that's really important. Now, in Brooke's question is something that we probably all need to confess a little bit. You've probably heard it, you've probably had it said to you, and you may have said it to others, and I confess to all three of those. Hey, if you're a person of faith, you just let it go and give it to God. You just stop worrying. The Bible says, fear not. The thing that is talked about fear all throughout the New Testament. It's mentioned more times and da-da-da-da-da. Okay, is all that truth? Yes, of course we know that. But I don't want us to miss that there are physical realities about anxiety that we experience as feelings. I talked about this in our mental health and mental wellness series, particularly with Dr. Daniel Amina of the Amen Clinics. And if you haven't listened to that episode, be sure and go back where we talk about the connection of your brain health and your emotional health. Too often we act like, particularly as people of faith, there's some really simple on-off switch if we really love God, that our physical body and the feelings that we're feeling in our physical body are just going to poop. We just flip a switch and it's over. And there you go. No more challenges with the emotions that we're dealing with. And yet that is not the full counsel of Scripture. We can look at people who write to us in Scripture about the experiences they were walking through. And so often they are beautifully describing the sense that they're having both in their racing thoughts and in the impact on their physical bodies. Things like depression, anxiety, confusion, all these things. God does not give us those narratives just for funsies. He's demonstrating that people who have deep faith and love him deeply experience times that are very challenging, experience times where the physical realities of their bodies and their worlds have a whole lot to do with the way that they're feeling. It's interesting for me because, as I told you, I grew up with an extended family where anxiety was pretty much on the menu a lot. And then I discovered when I did some genetics testing that I actually have what's called the MAOA, or the monoamine oxidase A gene. And this is known in popular parlance as the warrior gene. This means that you're somebody who your body chemicals are always ready for fight or flight at any moment. So the way that it works out for me a lot of times, if one of my kids drops something or slams a cabinet door and I wasn't expecting it, oh, friend, my heart rate will go through the roof. I will gasp. I will have this huge flood of reaction to that moment. And it's a physical trigger, but boy, I can feel it. And if I'm already a little bit anxious about an upcoming deadline for a book, or I'm trying to pack to go on a speaking trip, and somebody does something like that, there's some big noise that happens, you cannot convince my body that there's not something alarming going on. I mean, my body just reacts. And if I believe, and I do, from the book of Psalms, that I have been fearfully and amazingly knit together by God, then I have to believe that this is a feature that he gave me that is not something to hurt me, but is something that he imbued me with. Maybe it helps me have deeper compassion for people who are grappling with anxiety. Maybe it's something he put in me because there are things he wants me to be aware of, and I just have a heightened sense of awareness. I don't know, but it's not something that I need to beat myself up over or think that I can just, like we were talking about earlier, flip a switch and it's gone. The thing about the way that we are knit together is we are spiritual beings, and you've heard this phrase, spiritual beings having a physical experience. But don't let what's profound about that be brushed aside. You know, there were a group of people that in the early days of Christianity, there was a lot of concern about. And finally, church leaders had to say to early Christians, we need to separate out from these two groups. They were known as the Gnostics and the Essenes. And part of what these groups grappled with is they wanted to make everything about the physical body wrong, or they wanted to lean fully into it. And you can look up more on these two groups, but it was this place of either beating yourself up constantly about your physical body and the things that you grapple with, or just going for it and saying there were no holds barred on the physical body. And the problem of that is it's the extremes. It's not what God's intent for us was, which is to be spiritual beings who are inhabiting physical bodies that he gave us that are fearfully and wonderfully made. And so when we look at the physical ramifications of our feelings, I heard someone say recently that the reason that we call emotions feelings is because we feel them in our bodies. We need to stop being at war with ourselves over this. We need to be willing to take a look at how our body is reacting and the things that we're doing and connect it to the feelings that we're having for a greater understanding of how we've been knit together, what triggers us, what are the things that make life a little tricky, what we can do to be supportive of our spirits, our minds, our souls, and our bodies, and do that in a way that's cooperative with the way that God has uniquely wired you. So in realizing that I was actually also dealing with some anxiety, I needed to back up and get some tools and get equipped. And one of the things that I needed to become more aware about is what triggers me. So that's one of the questions I want you to ask yourself is, what triggers you? Really pay attention, become an archaeologist of your own life. I began to realize that particularly after a certain time of night, loud sounds, really robust conversations, my husband wanting to talk to me about our business decisions and things about my own business and his business, those kinds of things I began to realize were playing a huge role in making me anxious in the evenings particularly. And for me, I found for myself that those evening hours and how I lived those evening hours seemed to have a whole lot to do with my anxiety levels. And I can't really explain all of it. I don't know exactly why, but I'm honoring that's how God wired me. And so even in this crazy, crazy household of mine, and for those of you who are listening, who are my friends who live close to me, those of you who've been over to my home in the evening, you know that it is just like a party all the time. But I had to learn to start going through a wind down process in the evenings for myself and start limiting the level of noise. I also explained to my husband that while it doesn't have the same effect on him, I needed to stop conversations about business and work probably around 7:30 in the evening. It just, I don't know why, but my brain goes into hyperdrive on all that. And I will be awake half the night thinking through even just positive things like ideation, things that are happy, like, oh, we could do this and we could make that and da-da-da. But it's like, it's still a form of anxiety in a sense to be inspired that late at night and then it keeps me up and then I'm not sleeping. So those are some things that I realized I needed to bring down. And I realized there was a time of day I needed to think about that as well. I seem to be able to handle more of the feelings that I would say could go into full-blown anxiety. I seem to do better in the mornings than I do in the evenings. So ask yourself that. For you, it may be the mornings. There may be some things you need to think through. And there may be items. For me, it is things like loud noises, debates. My kids like start debating over some social topic in the evening, and it just sends me. It just sends me. Let's just put it that way. And conversations about business and work. So, what is it for you? Identify the things that seem to trigger you. Second thing that I did, this is going to sound a little odd, but I had to really look at my social media diet for me. And I want you to consider that for you too. Now, obviously, we know there's a whole wealth of things that can happen on social media when it comes to comparison, when it comes to catastrophizing or thinking we're not doing enough or just trying to measure ourselves up against other people. We know all that. And maybe for you, it just is, you're able to keep it a little more compartmentalized. What I realized was that there were accounts that I was following them for inspiration. I was following them to have better ideas for different components of my business or for my speaking or my writing or for inspiration. But what I realized is that in following those accounts, it was feeding this underlying fuel to some embers of anxiety for me. Anxious thoughts like, am I doing enough? Am I ever going to be able to do A, B, C, or D? Why didn't I get invited to speak at that thing? Oh no, what if I missed the boat on this particular book proposal that I was going to submit on this particular topic? And now I see there's this other book out there that seems really close and now it's already out there in the world. Did I miss my chance? All of those things, it reminds me of your barbecue grill, right? When you've got that little blue flame that comes up and you can either turn up the dial or turn down the dial. But the reality is, even if the dial is turned way down and you've got just a really low grade flame going, it's still hot in your grill. And so I realized that for me, there were certain accounts on social media, no one's fault, happy, inspirational, thoughtful, lovely social media accounts with great content that I needed to turn the dial off, because it was awakening anxiety in me that was not helpful in my everyday life. I talked to you about that wind down at night that I need to do. Even if you don't find that you experience as many anxious thoughts heading toward the evening, I still want to encourage you to do a wind down, because it tells your body, hey, we're starting to take a break. We're taking things down. Let's get in the jammies. Let's do all the things. I know those things can sound very intuitive, but I'm telling you, as a wife, a mom, as someone with a career, I often would hit the afterburners after dinner and try to get a whole lot of stuff done in the interest of time management, in the interest of trying to do stuff for my kids, in the interest of trying to squeak in just a little bit more work. If you can do it and it works for you, awesome. If you're in a short season where you feel like that's what you need to do, I totally get it, friend. I totally get it. But I am telling you, if you're finding your anxiety levels climbing and climbing and climbing, I really want to strongly encourage you, get back on a good evening routine before you're heading to bed. You might have to really flip some things in your schedule. There might be some things you need to take out. But there, for me, is a really important connection between the kind of rest, the mental rest I'm getting, the way I'm winding down, and how I'm dealing with those anxious thoughts. Another thing that I've had to limit, and that is the news. Now, I'm someone with a background in journalism. I was in radio and television, and I did news. I was on morning shows, all kinds of things. And so I just had a habit, and I actually had kind of a moral stance that it was important for me as a follower of Jesus to be aware of all of the hurts, challenges, tragedies, catastrophes in the world, so that I could be praying for people and I could maybe hopefully do something, send some funds or be aware. I really saw it as a moral code to be as informed as I could possibly be about the human condition across the globe. And I still think it's really important for us to be informed. But I have to tell you, when I would spend night after night wrestling, questioning, worrying, and then laying over some of those stories onto my own world and then catastrophizing out about that, what that would feel like, what that would be like. Well, I could get myself in such a state. And often the way that I would try to deal with anxiety was to then start doing stuff to try to take action. But I've heard it said recently, and I think there's some truth to it, that we were built for the village, not necessarily for the globe. What that means is there is only so much heartache, challenge, tragedy, catastrophe that we can take. And I don't want us to put our heads in the sand. I don't want us to not be people of action and to help others. But I do want us to be mindful that we're in quite an interesting, unprecedented social experiment here. You know, this is one of the first groupings of a series of generations who've had access to news across the world 24/7. That is not how things used to be. You would find out news, but it might take 3 or 4 days for it to come through, say, a telegram. Before that, it might take weeks before you got the monthly paper that was put out and you were living out in the country, and then you would get access to that news. But today, between social media, news channels, all access, we're bombarded constantly, which keeps our hearts and minds in an anxious state constantly. You can go look up some of the studies that have been done on this, how we are keeping ourselves at heightened levels that we were not intended to live by simply because of this hyper awareness and hyper access to all the things going on in all the world. So please don't put your head in the sand. Please remain open and vulnerable. Let God interrupt your life. Let your heart get broken for the things that break his heart. And also understand that if you are on a steady diet of that, it is going to have impact on your anxiety levels, both how that feels in your body and how you are experiencing the emotions of that. I tell you another one I had to do. Again, disclaimer, not promising that I am any kind of expert on this, but I had to cut out caffeine. This really speaks again to this connection of our bodies and the things that we feel. Caffeine for me was a major, major trigger for anxiety, and I didn't know it. I thought it was my productivity juice. I would have told you I had phenomenal tolerance for caffeine. I can drink a whole pot of coffee in the course of 6 hours. It doesn't affect me at all until I started limiting and cutting way, way back on caffeine. And then I realized, oh, yeah, it was impacting me deeply. So if you are someone who is on a lot of caffeine, I want you to consider, I know for some of you it's a dirty word, but I'm going to say it on air anyway. I want you to consider decaf. Decaf might be your best friend. Take it down a step, slow down, throttle back on the caffeine consumption. And that goes for sugar too. Sugar can do that to me as well. I can get really jittery and all the things on sugar, and then that seems to expand into how I'm thinking about things. So consider what you're eating, drinking. Those things can really have an impact on how you feel. Now, one of the thoughts that I want to help you make part of your vocabulary is ask yourself this. When you get into a heightened anxious state, when you're doing all the stuff, when you're trying to do all of these things that under the idea of high functioning anxiety, when you're doing that, ask yourself, what am I missing by focusing on the anxiety? And you might not even realize you're focusing on the anxiety because you're going 1,000,000 miles an hour. But that 1,000,000 miles an hour, my friend, I'm telling you, that can be a really important symptom of anxiety. So what are you missing by focusing on the anxiety? If you get super anxious over having all the family over for a celebratory dinner and you get yourself so worked up that you feel like you're almost in tears over the entree, or the charcuterie board didn't turn out right, or you forgot to wash the linen napkins and you're that upset, you are missing what the point of the thing was, which was to have family together, to have time together, to connect. It's important to identify with anxiety what you are missing to help your mind say, this is a value exchange. What do I really want out of this thing? Do I want the perfect dinner party, or do I want connection? Be sure to make this question part of your inner dialogue as you deal with these feelings of anxiousness. Now, there are a couple other things too. There have been some really interesting conversations coming out recently and some new research about the way that we think about anxiety. We typically immediately go to anxiety's bad. Anxiety, bad. But there's some interesting research that's coming out. I recently heard about a book called Good Anxiety from Dr. Wendy Suzuki. And she talks about that we shouldn't be trying to completely quell and quiet forever our system because it has some important internal warning systems for us. It can be an alarm system that is actually good for us. Have you ever been in a situation where something just feels kind of off? Like maybe you shouldn't be there or there's something not quite right? Well, that is part of your system that can then get triggered all the way into anxiety. But it's an important gift that God gave us. God gave us this internal warning system so we could recognize when things are moving beyond where they should be, or if something's off or something doesn't feel quite right. The goal is not to never, ever experience anxiety or nervousness or all of those kinds of things. The goal is to make sure that's not our steady state. But it isn't about shaming yourself that you should never have a moment where you get lit up or that something's not right and you know it. That is good. That is a gift. So there is a good form of anxiety that we don't want to miss. Another part of good anxiety is that it can show you what's not working. Now, this one I really think this is so powerful. And I will confess, it's really hard for me to sometimes see it this way. But if you are, let's go back to the dinner party example. You're trying to get the family dinner party all together. You're freaking out. And the one you had 6 months ago, you freaked out. And the one 3 months before that, you freaked out. And you felt so anxious. You were so upset. You were so nervous. You were so sweaty. You were so twitchy. Okay, you know what? There's something in that scenario that's actually not working for you. It could be that you need more help and you need to ask for help. It could be that it's become too complex for one person to manage, any person, even supermom, superwife, you. It's too much. And those feelings of anxiousness are actually showing you what's not working. So let's not take a system that God built and assume that it's only for our peril and it has no good for us. It can have good. We can see it as something that God gave to us as a way to not banish ever having these feelings, but to acknowledge and understand these feelings and the feelings that it creates in our bodies. Because as John 10:10 tells us, Jesus came that we should have life and have it abundantly. And when we're living in a steady state of anxiety and we're not receiving the gift of anxiety, which can alert us when something's not working and can alert us when something is wrong, that can keep us from living that abundant life. Now, of course, in all of this topic, of course we want to pray. Of course we want to seek scripture. Of course that we want to do the best we can with the help of the Holy Spirit to live in a position of faith and hope and not to be acting out of a position of fear. But I hope this has been really helpful to say it's not just about praying it away or hoping it'll go away or having enough faith that you will never have these feelings. God designed your parasympathetic nervous system. God knit you together in your very genetic code that these feelings and symptoms of anxiety may simply be a unique part of who you are, and you can use them as a superpower to be very aware of what's not working in your life and take it as an agent for change, for being on alert to understand when things aren't right, and to use that as a warning system for God to get to a safer place or do something that you need to do, and as a way to also come along and empathize and sympathize with those who may experience some of the same struggles that you do. Next episode, we're going to have some more questions from our listeners. I hope this was helpful for you today. Brooke, thank you for being willing to send in this question to reveal what you're grappling with. I hope that these have been thoughts. These are things I'm doing in my own life. I hope that there are things that can be of help to you. As always, here on the All Mom Does podcast, when you share an episode that has really been helpful to you, when you go ahead and click that link and share it to a couple of your friends, that is one of the biggest compliments and thank yous that you can give us, because that way we know that we're hitting the mark and talking about the things that impact you and intersect your daily life, and the things that you wonder about, the things you're needing help with, the places you want to be heard. So be sure and share with a couple of your friends. As always, the show notes have been put together for you by Rebecca, our content coordinator. So check out those show notes. She includes a full transcript of every episode. So if you're one of those people that you like to hear it, but then you also are reinforced by going and reading it, you can do that at the show notes. And check us out, allmomdoes.com, All Mom Does on all the socials. And I'm Julie Lyles Carr on all the socials. And I would love to hear from you too. I'll see you next time on the All Mom Does podcast.